talk about segregation and how it affects on the country?
Sure. Well, historically, segregation was a system that emerged out of the colonial period in American history, where Anglo-American communities or communities where people of European descent lived were separated from communities where people of color live, most specifically Native American and African American people. And so a lot of it arose out of the institution of slavery, where there were segregated living quarters, but there were always blurred lines within this concept of segregation, because African Americans would work in the homes of many Americans of European descent. And so that emerged as a way to organize cities, neighborhoods, towns, etc.
Right. Do you know any examples of people's experiences under segregation?
Excuse me. Yeah, sure. Well, for most of my father's and my mother's young adult lives, they lived in segregated communities. Not by choice, of course, but because that was the law of the land, essentially. And so segregation led to lots of challenges. You had dramatically different quality of schools. You would have a one-room schoolhouse, for instance, that was a part of segregation in the American South and in many northern cities, because segregation was a part of urban context too, in the north, not just in the south. And so their main experiences meant that they were not allowed to get bank loans, they weren't allowed to own homes, they weren't allowed to drink from water fountains. All the water fountains were labeled white or colored. They weren't allowed to use library cards or go to university unless they attended a segregated all-black university. So that was much of their experience until the modern civil rights movement began in the 1950s.
Okay. Do you know of any turning points against segregation, and if it does still exist?
Sure. Well, a two-part question. Great question. On the one hand, the big turning point against segregation was this modern civil rights movement, which began in the beginning of the 1950s. And you have, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Harvard graduate, basically beginning to try to organize movements across the South, but black Southerners had already begun to organize to protest for civil rights. And so this was an important part of that movement. Does it still exist today? I mean, not in the legal way that it was defined historically, but people self-segregate to some extent today. There were a series of responses by white American communities to the civil rights movement, and a lot of those responses were negative. There's this concept of white flight and black track. So white flight basically means that as the school systems were required to be integrated, white Americans decided to move their communities into suburban areas on the edges of cities where they could create their own schools and send their children there. So they did, and if the schools were private, then they weren't required to deal with integration as was stated by law. So it's mostly self-selected at this point. Black track is, the process of African Americans moving into the neighborhoods that were vacated by many white Americans when they began moving into the suburbs. So you have this two-part process.
Okay. Do you know what we can do in small communities to eliminate segregation, or at least delay it?
Well, sure. I mean, I don't think it actually exists in the legal sense of the civil rights movement anymore. And people are free to live where they want to. So, and that's a part of our Constitution too. But I would say, I think it is important to probably live in areas where there are lots of people with lots of different kinds of backgrounds, because it just enriches your overall experience and it helps you with problem solving. All communities have problems that they need to solve, and looking at this challenge, if you have a diverse set of mindsets that are addressing the problem, then you get lots of possible solutions that you might not otherwise get.
All right. Do you know of any specific, like, famous figures that have influenced the issue?
Sure, I think in the United States there were quite a few figures. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the figure for whom we have a national holiday, but there were other figures like Fannie Lou Hamer, Stokely Carmichael, Medgar Evers. There are many people who lost their lives trying to create a more legally fair playing field in the United States where housing was concerned. So these people all were important. Adam Clayton Powell was another important figure, and Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was eventually on the Supreme Court, was instrumental in helping many of these cases come to the Supreme Court level to be adjudicated. So those are all important figures.
Okay. Do you have any other concerns or questions or comments about the issue?
I don't think so. I know that segregation was a very important issue, and society has really adapted to respond to this. I guess if I did have an observation, it would be it remains an open question whether the law can change people's behavior. To some extent, it has, obviously changed where people have the option to live. But when you look at segregation, and specifically segregation is about housing. So, and there are some really powerful landmark cases on housing, but you still have redlining that occurs. Major corporations do engage in redlining. I know Bank of America engaged in redlining and was fined several millions of dollars by the Justice Department. Redlining basically means that people will offer a service that their company has, but they will only offer it in a limited community. So in redlining, if you have an Anglo-American community and there are communities of color around it, sometimes companies will only provide the service to the Anglo-American community and exclude other communities from gaining access. That redlining still happens today. It happens in the real estate field where people are shown certain properties based on where their identities are perceived to lie. So sometimes African Americans or Latinos or Asians are not shown properties in certain neighborhoods by realtors. That's a very active practice. There are lots of cases that move through the justice system every year dealing with redlining. So that part is the part where I mentioned, is it possible to change people's behavior? Maybe the law can't change people's behavior, but certainly tries to set a high standard for fair and ethical human engagement. So,
Okay. Thank you.
thank you.